The moment he laughed at my handmade gift, something shifted in that room, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough for me to notice the exact second respect turned into entertainment, and as the people around him followed his reaction, smiling, chuckling, some even leaning in to get a closer look at what he was mocking. I realized that this wasn't just about a gift anymore. It was about perception, about how quickly people decide what something is worth without understanding it, and while they saw something cheap, something meaningless. I saw something else entirely, something that didn't need their approval to have value, something that was already connected to a chain of events none of them could see yet. It wasn't expensive, not even close. There were no luxury materials, no brand name attached to it. No polished packaging designed to impress at first glance, but what it had was time, precision, and intent. Things that don't immediately show themselves unless someone is willing to look deeper, and that's what made his reaction so revealing, because instead of asking, instead of observing, he decided instantly, reducing something personal into a joke, and in doing that he unknowingly exposed something far more important than the value of the object itself. He lifted it slightly, turning it in his hand with a smirk that made it clear he had already formed his opinion, and when he spoke, it wasn't just a comment. It was a statement designed to entertain the room, something exaggerated just enough to get a reaction, and it worked because people laughed, not because they understood, but because they followed, because confidence often replaces accuracy in social situations. And in that moment he controlled the narrative without even realizing what he was stepping into. I didn't interrupt him, didn't correct him, didn't explain what it actually was, because sometimes explanation weakens impact, and silence allows people to fully commit to their assumptions, and once they do, those assumptions become harder to take back, and that's exactly what I needed, not for him to understand in that moment, but for him to believe completely in what he thought was true. The room moved on quickly, as it always does. Conversations shifted, attention drifted, and within minutes, the moment was forgotten by everyone except me, but forgetting something doesn't erase it. It just delays the point where it becomes relevant again, and in this case relevance wasn't immediate. It was scheduled, precise, and already in motion. Later that night, when everything was quiet and the noise of the day had faded, I replayed the moment in my head, not out of frustration, but out of confirmation, because by then it was clear that the situation had already taken its direction, and all that remained was timing, because timing, when used correctly, doesn't just create consequences, it defines how they unfold. The call I made wasn't emotional. It wasn't driven by anger or the need for revenge. It was calculated and measured, because decisions made in emotion often lose their effectiveness, but decisions made in clarity tend to last. And the person on the other end didn't need a long explanation. They only needed one detail to understand that something had changed. There was no dramatic reaction on that call, no surprise, no hesitation, just a quiet acknowledgement followed by a response that confirmed what I already knew. That once this process began, it wouldn't stop. Halfway, it wouldn't adjust based on regret or realization. It would continue exactly as designed. The next day, everything appeared normal on the surface. He went about his routine, attended meetings, made decisions, interacted with people, the same way he always did, completely unaware that something had already been set in motion beneath that normality. Something that didn't require his awareness to progress. That's the thing about real consequences. They don't announce themselves immediately. They don't create instant drama. They build quietly, step by step, until the point where they can no longer be ignored, and by the time they become visible, reversing them is no longer an option. The first disruption was small, almost insignificant, something that could easily be dismissed as an error. A delay, a minor inconsistency in a system that usually runs smoothly, and that's exactly how we treated it, as something temporary. Something that would correct itself without requiring much attention. But systems don't make emotional decisions. They follow inputs, triggers, and once something is activated, it doesn't reconsider. It continues, and that's what was happening here. A sequence that had already begun, one that didn't depend on his understanding to reach its conclusion. As more irregularities appeared, as small issues started to connect into something larger, the patterns slowly began to form. But patterns are only visible when someone is willing to step back and look at the whole picture, and at that point he was still focused on individual pieces, not the structure they were creating. It wasn't until the numbers started to shift that things became harder to ignore, not drastically at first, but enough to raise questions, enough to create a sense that something wasn't aligning the way it should, and that's when attention shifted from assumption to investigation. And that's where everything changed, because once you start looking for answers, you also start uncovering things you didn't expect to find, connections you didn't realize existed, and in his case, the more he searched, the closer he got to a truth that traced all the way back to a moment he thought didn't matter at all. At first he treated it like a temporary disruption, the kind of issue that appears in complex systems every now and then, something that can be fixed with a few emails, a couple of calls. Maybe a quick internal review, because when you're used to control, you assume every problem exists within your reach, within your ability to resolve, and that assumption creates a dangerous blind spot, one where you stop considering the possibility that the issue isn't something you can fix, but something you've already triggered. The emails started stacking up, not aggressively, not all at once, but steadily, each one carrying a tone that was slightly different from usual, more formal, more precise, less flexible. And that subtle shift is often the first real sign that something has changed at a structural level, because when systems tighten, when language becomes exact, it means decisions are no longer being negotiated, they're being enforced. He reached out to people he trusted, colleagues, partners. Individuals who had always been responsive, always reliable, expecting quick clarifications, simple reassurances. But what he got instead were delays, vague responses, and in some cases complete silence. And silence in professional environments is rarely accidental. It usually means one thing: that something has been decided without you. That's when the confidence started to crack, not visibly at first, not in a way anyone else could immediately notice, but internally, because once certainty is replaced with doubt, even slightly, every new detail begins to carry more weight. Every delay feels intentional. Every unanswered question starts to feel like part of something larger. He began reviewing numbers more carefully, going deeper into reports, looking for inconsistencies that could explain what was happening, but instead of finding clarity, he found patterns. Small shifts that repeated across different areas, subtle but consistent, and patterns like that don't happen randomly. They indicate design intention, something structured rather than accidental. The figure didn't appear all at once. It built itself slowly, line by line, adjustment by adjustment. Each change small enough to seem manageable on its own, but when combined, when viewed as a whole, it formed something much larger, something that couldn't be ignored anymore. And that's when the first real sense of urgency began to set in. 2.4 million wasn't just a number, it was a realization. A point where everything shifted from confusion into something undeniable, something that required explanation, because numbers at that scale don't just appear without reason. They point to something deeper, something that has already progressed far beyond the early stages. He started making calls, not the casual kind, but the kind driven by pressure, by the need to regain control, to understand where things had gone wrong, and more importantly, how to reverse them. But control, once disrupted at a structural level, doesn't return easily, especially when the system itself is no longer responding the way it used to. The responses he received were no longer aligned with his expectations. They were careful, controlled, and in some cases final, and that's when it became clear that whatever was happening wasn't being debated. It had already been decided, and he was only now becoming aware of it. And still, at this point, he hadn't connected it back to that moment, that small, seemingly insignificant interaction, because the human mind doesn't immediately link large consequences to small actions. It looks for bigger causes, more obvious triggers, not realizing that, sometimes, the smallest moments carry the most weight. But the deeper he went, the more he traced the timeline, the more everything started pointing back to a very specific point, a moment that didn't seem important at the time, a moment that had been dismissed almost instantly. And that's when the discomfort began to shift into something else, something closer to realization. Because realization doesn't arrive all at once, it builds, just like everything else in this situation, piece by piece, until it becomes impossible to ignore, and when it finally takes shape, it doesn't just explain what happened, it changes how you see the moment that caused it. He replayed it in his head, the laughter, the comment, the way the room reacted, the way I didn't respond, and that's what stood out the most, not what he said, but what I didn't say. Because silence, in hindsight, often carries more meaning than words. That's when the connection locked into place, not as a theory, not as a possibility, but as something much more certain, because everything aligned too precisely, the timing, the sequence, the outcomes, all tracing back to that single point, that single moment. And in that realization, something changed in him, not externally, not yet, but internally, because understanding that a situation is connected to your own action creates a different kind of pressure, one that doesn't just focus on solving the problem, but on accepting responsibility for triggering it. He tried to find alternatives, other explanations, other causes that could make more sense, that could remove that connection, but the more he searched, the more everything kept leading back to the same place, reinforcing the same conclusion. Because systems like this don't leave gaps, they don't create loose ends, they are designed to be complete, to connect every step, every trigger, every outcome, and once you're inside that system, once you've activated it, stepping out isn't an option. The pressure escalated quickly after that, because once awareness is there, inaction becomes impossible. Every second without resolution feels heavier, every delay more dangerous, and that urgency pushes decisions, often rushed, often ineffective. But the truth was, by that point, decisions didn't matter the way he thought they did, because the most important decision had already been made, not recently, not during the investigation, but earlier, in a moment he didn't even recognize as important. And that's when it fully hit him. This wasn't happening because of something he was doing now, it was happening because of something he had already done. Once that realization settled in, everything around him began to feel different, not because the environment had changed, but because his understanding of it had, and that shift is powerful. Because when perception changes, every detail starts to carry new meaning. Every interaction feels loaded, every delay feels intentional, and suddenly what once seemed normal starts to feel like part of something structured, something already moving without his control. He went back through the timeline again, this time more carefully, more slowly, trying to identify the exact moment where things crossed from normal into irreversible, and every path led him back to the same place, that room, that moment, that laugh. And more importantly, the silence that followed it, because silence, when chosen deliberately, is rarely empty. That's when he started asking a different kind of question, not what is happening, but who made this happen, because once a situation shows signs of structure, of precision, it stops feeling accidental and starts feeling intentional, and intentional outcomes always have a source. And for the first time I entered his thoughts, not as a background presence, not as someone insignificant, but as a possibility, as a variable he hadn't considered before, and that shift alone changed everything, because once someone starts looking at you differently, they begin to re-evaluate every interaction they've had with you. He tried to recall details about me, small things, conversations, behaviors, anything that might explain how I could be connected to something, this precise, this controlled. But the problem was, I had never given him a reason to look deeper, and that's what made it effective. Because the less someone notices you, the less they prepare for you. Meanwhile, the situation continued progressing exactly as designed, not slowing down, not accelerating, just moving forward with consistency. And consistency is what removes hope, because when something behaves predictably, it becomes clear that it isn't reacting to your actions, it's following its own path. The financial impact became harder to manage, not just because of the amount, but because of the limitations it created. Options that once existed were no longer available. Solutions that would have worked before were no longer effective, and that narrowing of options is what creates real pressure, because it forces you to confront the situation directly. He reached out again, higher this time, trying to escalate, trying to find someone with enough authority to intervene, to pause what was happening, to create space for negotiation. But escalation only works when there's flexibility, and in this case there wasn't any. The responses became clearer, more direct, less open to interpretation, and that clarity removed the last layer of denial, because once something is stated plainly, there's no room left to reinterpret it, no space to convince yourself that it might mean something else. That's when urgency turned into pressure, and pressure turned into something heavier, something closer to panic, not visible on the surface, but present in the way he moved, the way he spoke, the way he searched for answers that weren't there. And still the system continued, unaffected by his reaction, unaffected by his attempts to change it, because once a process like this reaches a certain point, it doesn't adapt, it completes, and completion doesn't require permission. That's when the second realization hit, deeper than the first, more unsettling, because it wasn't just about what had happened, it was about what couldn't happen anymore. The realization that reversal wasn't just difficult, it was impossible. He started thinking differently after that, not about fixing it, but about understanding it, because when solutions disappear, understanding becomes the only thing left to pursue, and even that doesn't guarantee relief, it only guarantees clarity. And clarity in situations like this doesn't comfort you. It exposes everything, every assumption, every decision, every moment that led to this point, and the more clearly he saw it, the heavier it became. Because now it wasn't just a financial loss, it was a chain reaction that started with something he considered meaningless, something he dismissed without a second thought, and that contrast between cause and effect is what made it so difficult to accept. He thought back to the gift again, but this time not as an object, but as a trigger, something that represented more than what it appeared to be, something that carried weight he didn't recognize at the time. And that's when the final connection formed, not just between the moment and the outcome, but between me and everything that followed, because by then it was impossible to ignore the alignment, the timing, the precision of it all. The question wasn't if anymore, it was how. How something so small led to something so large, how someone he overlooked became central to everything, and more importantly, how he completely missed it. Because the truth was finally clear, he didn't lose $2.4 million because of bad luck, he lost it because he underestimated the wrong person. By the time everything reached its final stage, the situation no longer felt like a problem to solve, but like a reality to accept. Because there's a point in every chain of consequences where effort stops making a difference, where action no longer changes direction. And that point had already been crossed without him realizing it long before he started looking for answers, long before he even understood that something was wrong. The numbers were no longer shifting. They had settled, stabilized into something final, something that didn't fluctuate anymore. And that stability is what makes loss feel real, because as long as things are changing, there's hope. But once they stop, once everything becomes fixed, that's when the weight fully lands. 2.4 million wasn't just an amount anymore. It became a marker, a permanent reference point. Something that would always exist as a reminder of how everything unfolded, not just financially but psychologically, because losses like that don't stay limited to numbers. They reshape how you think, how you trust, how you judge situations. And yet even at that stage, the system behind it remained invisible in the way it always had been, not because it was hidden, but because it was never meant to be obvious. It didn't rely on secrecy, it relied on assumption, on the fact that people rarely question what they don't notice. From my side, nothing needed to be said. Nothing needed to be confirmed, because everything had already played out exactly as it was supposed to, and outcomes like that don't require explanation. They explain themselves through their precision, through how cleanly everything aligns once it's complete. He eventually stopped searching for alternatives, not because he wanted to, but because there weren't any left. Every path he explored led to the same conclusion. Every attempt brought him back to the same point. And repetition like that doesn't just inform you, it forces acceptance. And acceptance doesn't come with relief, it comes with understanding, a quiet, heavy realization that nothing about this was random, nothing about it was accidental, every step had a reason, every outcome had a cause, and all of it connected back to something he once dismissed without hesitation. The memory of that moment changed completely for him. What once felt small now felt significant. What once felt harmless now felt critical. And that shift is what makes hindsight so powerful, because it doesn't change what happened. It changes how you see it. He likely replayed it more times than he wanted to admit, analyzing every detail, every word, every reaction, trying to understand what he missed, trying to find the exact point where things could have gone differently. But that's the thing about moments like that. They only offer one chance to be handled correctly. Because once a decision is made, once a reaction is given, it becomes part of a sequence that can't be undone, only experienced, and in his case, that sequence had already completed itself in full. For me, it was never about revenge, never about proving a point in the way people might assume. It was about structure, about ensuring that no matter how something appeared on the surface, there was always something deeper holding it in place. The gift was never just a gift. It was a test, a moment that revealed more than it seemed to, a moment that showed exactly how he evaluated things, how quickly he judged, how easily he dismissed, and that information was far more valuable than any reaction could have been. Because people rarely lose because of one big mistake. They lose because of patterns of thinking, patterns of behavior, patterns that remain invisible until something forces them into the open. And in this case, that something wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud, it was quiet, controlled, almost invisible until the very end. And that's what made it effective, because by the time it became visible, it was already finished. The room where it all started probably never thought about that moment again. To them, it was just another interaction, another conversation, something that came and went without importance. But for him, it became the defining point of everything that followed. Because that's how moments work. Some pass unnoticed, and some quietly change everything. And the difference between the two isn't in the moment itself, it's in how you treat it. Respect isn't about the value you see, it's about the value you fail to recognize. Because in the end, he didn't lose 2.4 million because of a system or a mistake or even a bad decision made under pressure. He lost it because he laughed at the wrong moment, at the wrong person.